Greetings and welcome to No BS Baking. My name's JP, and today we're going to talk a little bit about pH. Now, I've seen a few videos out there, especially one channel in particular, and this guy running around with his pH pen and this, checking that. Do you really need a pH pen? He poses the question. Look, I don't know. I've got this video here. What I've done is I've pulled it all together to explain what pH is, the importance of pH, and I even leaned a little bit into the sourdough side. Because, really when it comes to acid and how acid builds up in a product, there's not a better example than sourdough. That's low pH product. So, without getting too much into it, welcome back to the channel. Check this video out and be sure to leave your comments and everything below. Okay, let's just start this off by taking a look at the pH scale. Here's a standard pH scale. 0 to 14. Neutral being 7. This side is the acid side. This side is the alkaline side. For every point that you step off the 7 neutral, your acid strength increases by 10. So from 7 neutral to 6, it's 10 times stronger acidic than neutral 7. Thus, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. This works on both the acid side and, of course, the alkaline side. So you can see that moving basically one step from 5 to 4 is a significant amount of change with respect to the strength of the acid in your dough or in your solution, whatever it is that you're measuring. So I just wanted to explain that. Okay, let's talk what is pH. pH is an acronym which stands for potential of hydrogen. It's basically the measurement of the acidity or alkalinity that you have in a solution or in your dough or whatever. And a pH pen is used to determine those values. Now, pH is a measurement of strength of acid or alkalinity. And that's important to keep in mind as we move a little bit further down here. Is it important in baking? It's absolutely important in baking. And we're going to discuss the reasons why and the different types of effects that it has, not only just on yeast, but on the gluten and protein structure in your doughs, and how all of these things kind of come in to play a role in providing you not only the type of product that you're looking for, but all the characteristics that you're looking for at the end of the day. So let's move on. When you first make a starter or poolish, you're adding flour and water together. Those two in combination generally works out to a pH of around 6.5. When you first make a biga or a sponge, flour, water, and now a little bit of yeast, once again, you're at about 6.5 on the pH scale. And finally, when you first make your bread or bun dough, adding flour, water, yeast, and even salt, you generally are around the 6.5 pH start point. So you take water and you take flour and you mix it together, and then the party begins. So yeast, in conjunction with its buddy, lactobacillus bacteria, they start the whole process. They immediately attack the starches, break those starches down into simple sugars. The yeast has its way with them. It loves those sugars, and as a byproduct of feeding on them, gives off ethanol and the gas that leavens bread. Also working with the lactobacillus, they're producing lactic acid and acetic acid, which is having a conditioning effect on the gluten protein in your flour. So, although lactobacillus is the most common or prevalent bacterial type in a dough system, other bacterial communities will want to join this party also. Some of them are similar to lactobacillus, some are not. So as I mentioned, there's many types of bacterial communities that want to come in and get into this dough system. Which ones come, how many, and how long they stay depends on a couple of key important factors, such as the pH. Some bacteria really groove at certain pH levels. Temperature, how quickly the temperature is affecting the yeast activity, and ultimately the pH is changing. So if it's changing very quickly, some bacteria might be in and out very quickly. If the temperature is not really very exciting for yeast and things are moving slower, then certain bacteria will hang out a lot longer. And this is how you get your flavor notes. Okay, different bacteria producing different types of acids give you these flavor notes that bakers have come to strive for in their processes. Now, besides the flavor, texture, taste, and shelf life all are things that are contributed to by these various bacteria. So as fermentation begins, just through the natural process of yeast and bacteria working in harmony, the pH begins to fall. This lowering of the pH is a direct result of acids being formed in the dough, as we talked about, lactic and acetic acids. These acids act as a kind of natural conditioner for the gluten protein. And as the acids get incorporated in there and start building within the dough system, they start to relax the proteins, and all of the protein bonds begin to line up a little bit better, creating a nice extensibility in your dough and better gas retention properties at the end of the day. And this is the reason, one of the main reasons why bakers have been giving these rest times to their products when they don't use any type of no-time conditioners. So it's a conditioning effect. As you start getting down into the low ranges, this is kind of like where sourdough is, you can see that the acids really made the dough very extensible. The protein is all lined up. That's the reason why you don't have to actually mix sourdough very much. If you give your dough enough time, you will build gluten strength without mixing. It's just a natural process. If you start getting down into the really low ends, though, of course, you'll start experiencing some degradation in your gluten strength and at the far ends of the scale. Now, up here on the high range, basically what happens is the gluten just becomes tough. It really doesn't start doing anything. It's just rock hard. It fights you all the way. And that's the reason why bakers generally just don't bake up here. Yeast doesn't work up here. Gluten's not happy up here. So this is just an example of what would happen in the event that you were really, really on the high side of the pH scale. Once again, it doesn't really matter what you got. You start getting up into these really high ends, and you will get degradation also on both ends of the scale. So that is gluten as it pertains to acid development within the dough and the natural conditioning components that those acids offer. So, I mean, as we talked, you can see here that with respect to yeast, the optimum range for yeast worth is absolutely most happiest is around between 5 and 6. You start getting down into these lower ends where sourdough and some of these long ferment artisan style breads are made. It's not quite as happy, but still will perform okay down in and around the 4 range. And even beyond to a certain degree, however, you will find that yeast activity will slow down as you start moving much further past this point. Same thing up in the high range. We talked about that your bread, once you mix flour and water together, you're generally sitting in and around the 6.5, might even be a little higher if you have very alkaline water. And once it's all kind of balanced out with the acidity in the flour and you've got this alkaline water, maybe you're around 7. Don't worry about it too much. 7 is still okay. Once again, yeast is not particularly happy on 7 or a little bit over, but can still operate at that level. And ultimately, as long as you've got it doing its job, even at the higher range of the pH scale, it will slowly start bringing down the pH as the fermentation process happens. As the pH drops, the yeast gets happier and happier, and away you go. So don't sweat it too much in the event that you're using a very alkaline water. It will sort itself all out if you are in this range right here. So when you're thinking about pH, remember that pH is a measurement of the acid or alkaline strength that you have in a particular solution or dough, etc. But pH does not tell you how much acid is actually in that dough or in that solution. Let me explain. So as I mentioned, pH is one measurement for acid strength or alkalinity in a dough system. Let me explain here. If you take 10 milliliters of acid and you pour that into a glass that contains 100 milliliters of distilled water, and then you take a pH of that, you're going to see that your pH, let's just say for this example, comes out at around 4. So you take that same acid and you fill that up into a glass, and you fill that right up to the 100 ml line, no distilled water in there, and you take a pH of it, and it also is 4. And this is part of the reason why pH is only really half the story. It tells you the strength of the acid, but it does not take into consideration how much acid. And how much acid that's in your dough, especially sourdoughs, is a very important part of the whole equation. Okay, so we all know now that acid development is part of any dough fermentation process. As the yeast gets working, along with its buddies bacteria, pH drops in a bread dough. But anyway, to really demonstrate the total effects of acid in a bread dough, let's pick sourdough and talk a bit about it. So with respect to acid development in your dough, remember, every sourdough is different. Now, let's just say that you decided to do a day of baking. You're gonna make a sourdough, and you contact your neighbor and you tell him what you're doing. He says, "Hey, I'm doing the same thing." You said, "Wow, fantastic." You know, you guys both shared recipes, so you started your starters kind of around the same time. You used the same recipe. You basically got your processes very, very similar, using the same fermentation times, and you call up your neighbor and you say, "Hey, I just checked my dough after the bulk fermentation, and wow, the dough came out at a 4.1. He says, "I just did the same thing. I just pulled mine from the bulk fermentation, and guess what? Mine came out at 4.1 also." Fantastic. You guys both basically, same procedures, same recipes, and you both came out at 4.1. That is fantastic. However, you sit there and you're looking at your bread and you're saying, "I'm going to take this over to my neighbor's. I got to let him check it out." And he's doing the same thing, and he wants you to show you his. Now, when you guys look at the two different loaves of bread, you're thinking, holy smokes. I mean, these are totally different breads. Mine doesn't seem to have as much volume as my neighbor's does. His is a little bit colored in a different way. What is going on? Other than maybe some minor irregularities with respect to your oven and your baking time or something along those lines, you're going to have different looking product. But remember one thing. Every sourdough is different because every sourdough has a completely different quantities of acid. Now the acid buildup, as I've talked previous, depends on the party that's going on in there. The temperature that you're storing your starter at, the temperature that you're bulk fermenting at, the time you're giving it, the time, the temperature, all of these factors come into play as to who and which bacteria attend the party. Flour, you guys could be using the exact same flour from the exact same company, but you've got a different batch from, it's a little bit older, or it's a newer batch. All of these little differences come into play with respect to the bacteria yeast party. Again, location. Maybe you do your bulk fermenting into an area that's a lot cooler, but it's also maybe susceptible to different types of bacteria in that area. All of these things all play a major role, and what I'm trying to say is that literally this list could go on and on and on as to why you can get completely different quantities of acid in your bread. Okay, so if pH isn't going to tell me how much acid's in my dough, then how do I find this out? Well, the answer is through another test called total titratable acidity. Now, you're not going to probably do this because, you need a lot of equipment for it. Most of this equipment you'd find in a laboratory. Commercial baking companies would maybe do this for their products. When they're really dialing in on a recipe or a process. For the hobby baker, it's not really something to concern yourself with too much. I'm going to give you some really easy ways to be able to manage your acid levels and quantities coming up here right now. So now that we've gone through all of this acid stuff, is this something that I need to be concerned about? Well, the answer is really no. I mean, if you've got a really off taste, or your sourdough that you're producing is just too sour, or it almost has a bit of a vinegary kind of a smell, and maybe you might want to look at some other options. If you're thinking that maybe it's too acid and you're not getting the oven spring that you're looking for, or you're not getting the type of grain texture that you want, that really open grain, then you may want to look at tweaking some things and see how it works. But always make sure that you start with your process. Make sure that you tighten your process up and that you're doing all your proper folding, and you're doing the process like it is supposed to be done. And there's many great videos out there on how to make sourdoughs. So start with your process, make sure that that's all cool, but definitely if you've got a flavor issue, you can do some things to sort that out. So as I mentioned here, can you adjust the dough for more or less acid? The answer is yes. Okay, now this is a video on pH, so I didn't really want to beat this to death. But the last question was, can I do something to maybe adjust the amount of acid that I have in my particular dough, especially sourdoughs, of course. Well, really quickly, and you can reduce the amount of sourdough starter you put in your dough. If your formula calls for 20%, say as an example, that's what you normally put in, maybe cut it back to 15. Okay? You can reduce the bulk fermentation time. Sourdoughs, many of them have all these rest steps, and on top of that they have like maybe a 4-hour bulk fermentation. Drop it down an hour, maybe only half an hour. Play around it from that angle. You can also, from your starter when you're feeding it, instead of leaving in 10 grams of starter and then topping it up with whatever, 200 grams of flour or whatever you put into it, into your particular starter, try putting a little less leftover starter in there and replenish it a little bit more often. This will also aid in reducing the amount of acid that you have in your base starter. So anyway, there's a couple of just real quick ones for you. Now when you start baking, one of the first things that you should really kind of clue in on, and that is the pH of your water. It's important to know where your water sits approximately. Some areas it can be 6.3, 6.5. Other places it can be over 8. Especially in Europe, I've seen this many, many times. Do you need to get a pH pen and spend the money on all that stuff for it? No, not really. You know, you can start off by doing things simple, doing things cheap. Get a simple pH test kit, fill up a glass or a part of a glass and stick one of these strips in there. Gives you a close enough idea where it is. Ideally, you'd like to be in and around 7 or lower. But if you're a little bit high, and I would say you can go all the way up to a little bit over 8, no higher than say 8.5. But I would say if you're 8.2, something like that, don't worry about it too much. And I'll explain to you why in a minute. Now, also, if you want to check out your dough and see where your dough's at, there's a simple test that you can do for this. Once again, you don't need to go invest in a pH pen. You just take a 10 grams of dough, you get 100 milliliters of distilled water again, which is 7 neutral. Bottled water should be pretty close. If I didn't have any distilled water handy, I would probably go for it with some proper bottled water. Give it a good stir. Make sure that that dough is all kind of broken down and it's become kind of like a milky kind of a substance in there. Give it a good stir, and then I would take a pH from that. Once again, that's going to get you close enough that you will have an idea of where your dough is at after you've done your trip and got your ingredients and everything in there. This one here you don't really need to worry about too much. As long as your water isn't anything really crazy on the alkaline side, you're pretty much good to go. Okay, as I mentioned in the previous slide, if you got water at 8.2, don't really sweat it too much. As you can see, the most important thing that I'm trying to show here is that flour is generally acidic. So if you've got acidic flour, you're adding it adding it with water that's alkaline, you get a buffering effect. And generally, after you've added your water into the flour, you're going to get it buffered well enough that it's going to fall into a range that's going to work okay for yeast. As the yeast and the bacteria get going, they're going to start driving down the pH anyway, and so ultimately the bread will become more happier just with a little bit of time. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you walked away with just a little bit more information than what you came in with. That's always my goal. Help you become a better baker, help your understanding of baking science and the process of baking. So until next time, keep an eye out for some really cool stuff I got upcoming, and we'll see you then.